Hi, everybody. This is Arthi from Human Chapters. I'll tell you a little bit about human chapters. Humans are living narratives with a past, present, and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these conversations is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a worthy story to share. In acknowledgement to country, we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet. We pay respect to their tribal elders, past and present and emerging. We celebrate their continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. Today, I am so honored to be talking to Karla about her chapter, which involves her research journey. Welcome, Karla. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much, Artie. It's fantastic to be here. I'm honored to be included in this journey that you're making. Okay, tell you about my research. Well, I've been a researcher in the field of speech language pathology for over 30 years now, and I came to this work, I would say, because I really believe in the power of words, and I began by training as a clinician, which I thoroughly enjoyed, but then really realized that I think my talent and my passion was more in the discovery of new knowledge, new information that could, if all works well, move the field forward and improve lives of children. Children in particular was my focus. Child language is my focus. And I do a lot of research on a condition called developmental language disorder, and that's been my focus for my entire career.
That's incredible, Karla. Tell us about your journey as a clinician, but what got you thinking about the research world?
Well, it happened really quickly for me. So I went directly from my master's level training, which in the United States is the terminal degree for becoming a clinician, a speech
Mm,
language pathologist or therapist. And I went directly from that degree into the PhD so that I
yeah,
could learn to do research. I did get my certification along the way, and I'm glad that I did because as a scientist who likes to ask translational questions, having that clinical background, even though I really never
mm,
practiced, but that clinical training and experience with practicum in grad school has been really meaningful to me.
yeah.
Helps me out know what questions are important to ask.
Mm,
And so I do cherish that chapter of my work,
mm,
even though it was a very brief one for me.
yeah.
But I've been in research in academia, Northwestern University and the University of Iowa. And then recently I left academia, but I'm still very active in the research world and just loving it.
That's amazing. Um, the phrase that grabbed my attention was knowing, or actually the sentence, knowing the questions to ask. Tell us
Mhm.
about what you started off in research
Mhm.
when you first stepped into this journey, why that was the question,
Right.
and yeah, particular insights you've gained.
Well, I was certainly very, very influenced by my first mentor, and who still is really my mentor, Dr. Larry Leonard. And his work was, of course, very influential in guiding me to this particular path.
Mm,
I have always been interested in language. I've always been interested in words. And so my master's thesis was on word finding difficulties. And then I went towards word learning experiments, which I still do now, mostly because I felt like in a child in a developing system, it was very difficult to parse what they knew about the words
mm,
that they seemingly had trouble finding, but how well did they actually even know them? Because their lexicon is still very much in the throes of development. So that kind of took me towards word learning. I still do that. And then in more recent years, I've done a lot of research on that sort of reflects newfound interest in advocacy for people who have developmental language disorder, understanding the impact of that condition on their learning, on their lives, and trying to, I think, broaden my focus away from a specific aspect or challenge associated with the condition to increasing understanding and awareness of the condition. I think that's been a huge barrier for people who have developmental language disorder or DLD. It often goes undiagnosed, and I think lack of awareness plays into that, because you get into the cycle of do we have a scientific knowledge base to draw from for understanding how to diagnose and treat? Do governments, do policymakers understand the condition well enough to want to fund clinical programs and research into the condition? So I think that lack of awareness was really a barrier, continues to be a barrier to progress in that part of our field. Although I think we are making giant steps forward.
Yeah. And I appreciate the research component so much more now. And I'm saying this after nearly 14 years in the field. I've just completed a master's of learning interventions, and something that a population that I really focused on was DLD. And it was incredible. Like, I wanted to understand, does language interventions have an impact on their capacity to learn, basically, and move?
Right.
Yeah. And it was really interesting and actually at some point confronting to realize that we don't have enough research and there are so many factors playing into it. But the fact that I was like, oh wow, it just goes to show that you could have been working in a field for so long and we are trained to do evidence-based, implement and employ evidence-based practices to ensure our clients are able to access the world around them.
Right.
And for us not to have those tools, how important research is, but more importantly, how important that research to practice translation
Yes.
and yeah, employment really is. That has been a fascinating insight, just for me as a consumer of research.
Right, absolutely. And as a producer of research, of
Yeah.
course, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's really a web, or maybe a tapestry is a better
Mm.
analogy, because we we all, I think, lift up the field, and as part of that, ultimately lift up the
Mm.
children and families we work with. But if we do that in silos and we aren't generating knowledge and applying knowledge, what's the point? We're not going to be doing it very well.
Mm.
So I have equally mutual respect for what the clinicians in our field are doing. They're amazing. They're champions. Absolutely.
Yes. And the other insight I have before we go into delve a little bit deeper into the research world is, before you talked about the power of language, the importance of words, how it shapes everything we do, really. And for a population that's finding it difficult to either understand or express or both, just what might their world be like, is something that I think about nearly daily to,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, I agree. Communication as a human right, the
Mm.
right to be able to express yourself, to express your opinion, to communicate and learn.
Mm.
Your colleagues in Australia have done a great bit of work in championing communication as a human right. And I have their document, the children's version of the Bill of Human Rights, from it was a oh it's not it fell off. It was a poster on my wall. I need to have it remounted. But I just love that communication is included in that list of human rights, because it is absolutely essential to making relationships and to learning and to well-being.
Absolutely. Carla, tell us about a part of research that many of us are actually not forced to think about. Just before the call, we talked briefly about there are so many aspects, and I alluded to it just a little while ago, that sometimes the research is not available, but there are so many factors that play into research. Um, Maybe we can talk about a part that's not, we're not necessarily forced to think about, but also a part that's not openly discussed. Um, and it could be, I don't know, called the dark side of research, for lack of a better phrase.
Well,
Yeah.
now you've tempted the audience, haven't you?
Yeah.
The dark side of research. Yeah. Yes. Well, no, thank you for giving me that opening, because when you contacted me about talking with you, and you said I could pick the particular chapter I wanted to focus on, and I felt like it was absolutely imperative that I talk about the current chapter that I'm in right now. So I'm a scientist in the United States, and science in the United States is under a great threat right now, because the United States is slipping from a democracy and moving towards authoritarianism. And that puts many, many constraints and barriers towards realizing and honoring human rights. And then also more specifically, the conducting of science. So I do want to talk about that with you today. I need to start with a disclaimer, and that's so there are great limits now, increasing limits on freedom of speech in the United States. And so I've actually checked with my employer to make sure it's okay that I express my viewpoints. So I need to say the disclaimer, and of course it is okay with them, but I need to state the disclaimer that they are my opinions, not those of necessarily my employer. I'm also going to, perhaps we'll get to places in the conversation where I talk about extraordinary things that colleagues are doing, but I'm not going to name them because I don't want, I want them to have the freedom to make that decision, because sometimes there are consequences these days. I also want to do one more disclaimer, which is that as we move into talking about science in a political world, I'm not an authority on politics or government, and I'm not a source of news about the United States. So I'm not going to really talk about too much about that. I'm just going to talk about how this context is affecting scientific progress and human rights. But for people who might want to know more, or are looking for great sources of information about what's going on in the United States, I would say our National Public Radio. I don't know how accessible that is to people outside the US, frankly, but it's a very solid, reputable source of news. I often read The Guardian, which is from the UK, and I've only been reading The Guardian in the past few years, and I'm finding that I'm reading it because it's not a US publication, so they don't have the same constraints on freedom of the press that are now happening in the US. And then if you really want to dig deep, there's a Substack. It's I'm reading the name so I get it right. It's Heather Cox Richardson's Letters from an American. Letters from an American. You can subscribe to that for free. Heather Cox Richardson is a historian at Boston University, and she is just amazing at distilling what's happening and putting it into a historical context, which makes it so much more meaningful. So that would be my recommendation to people who are listening and want more of that background. But I think what I really want to talk about is what this authoritarian movement in the States means for our science. And I think the way to start thinking about it is that there isn't any good way to defend racism, sexism, ableism, classism, any ism with scientific evidence,
Mm.
much, much less with morality. There's no good way to do that. And so what's happening is a rejection of
Mm.
scientific evidence. So opinions are taken as facts, and if it's your opinion, then that's fine. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. And that's landing us in
Mm.
a very difficult situation where there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of distrust of science and expertise, and there's some real consequences for all of science, but I think for our field in particular and the people that we serve and care about in our field.
That,
That's a
Karla,
lot.
to even try to compute it. So, as a before I said I'm a consumer of research, to understand how to perhaps do things in a way, research is very carefully curated and it's almost an art form in itself. It's a design, it's, how you're interacting with people, how you're putting practices in place, for who you're putting practices in place, for how long. There is so much to think about. It's almost a script. We're providing as part of service, but then to hear your part of it going opinions as facts, it leads me to think about, apart from the US um, climate at the moment, how long that actually has been happening for. Opinions as facts, thinking about social media, thinking about how much is there that either is credible, not credible. How do we differentiate how the portion of credibility in sources that we are consuming? But I'd love for you to tell us how this has impacted your work,
Mhm.
your and the position you bring to your work.
Right, right. You're absolutely correct to say that opinion as fact is a problem that extends well beyond the US, because I think in to a large extent, as you mentioned, many social media outlets are not reputable. And I also think that AI, we haven't quite, we as a community of humans haven't quite figured out how to use AI for its best purposes. And so I think AI generated information is often false. And, and because AI is increasingly good, it's increasingly difficult to tell if it's AI, right? So I think that's another barrier. And of course, that's something that happens all over, not just in the US. I think in the US, it's compounded because of limits on a free press.
Mm,
So we not only have the misinformation, but then we have limits and barriers to people who are trying to get out
yeah.
real information. And I think that definitely includes scientists.
Mm,
So to give an example that I think would resonate, we we are now faced in the United States with this reemergence of the debunked hypothesis that vaccines cause autism.
mm,
So the evidence just says that it doesn't, and that question has been long studied.
mm,
And the field moved on, right? And so there are only so many dollars to devote to research. And what's happening now is that some of our research dollars in the US are going to be funneled towards rekindling studies of vaccines as a cause
mm,
for autism, which is a complete waste of money
mm,
in other science that is pursuing more promising hypotheses, of course,
mm,
may be affected by those dominoes. And very importantly, families are affected because they can believe that vaccines are dangerous and not have their children vaccinated. We've just recently, several places in the US have seen a reappearance of measles. And measles had been eradicated in the US. So these are very dangerous ideas, very dangerous opinions that are being paraded as facts, and they're affecting science, they're affecting people's understanding of reality, and they're affecting families and children for sure.
Yeah. And the other thing, all of this, our interaction gets me to think about is the types of questions we're asking and where that's coming from. To be
Mhm.
able to discriminate between credible sources and misinformation, and actually to get to the heart of the matter, one
Mhm.
actually needs to have a lot of information to begin with.
Right.
And to know, to be able to follow arguments, to be able to understand where the other person's coming from, why they might be saying this. And to be fair, that's a lot of brain work. That's a
Right.
lot of cognitive energy that we are having to expend on understanding this information. Um, Carla, is there a way that you see that is hopeful, or some things that you are grappling with at this very moment, but at the same time, there is something you could do that you can,
Right.
yeah.
Excellent question. Well, one thing that colleagues and I have done, golly, I should have looked back at when we did it, but I'd say we're at it for at least 10 years. We've established a website called DLD and Me,
Yeah.
dldandme.org. And we established it obviously well before this current political crisis,
Mm.
but not before the crisis of misinformation and helping people to find scientific evidence. We started it because we really wanted to increase awareness of developmental language disorder, but we also wanted to make sure that in increasing that awareness and understanding, what we were pushing out into the world is evidence-based information.
Mm.
And so what we do at DLD and Me is we make blog posts that they're relatively brief. They're usually like a
Mhm.
page long on various topics that are related to children's language development and especially
Mhm.
to developmental language disorder. And when we began, we were focused particularly on families, on getting this information to parents. Now we've expanded a bit and we are pushing out information for teachers, for speech language therapists, and for youth who they
Mhm.
themselves have DLD, youth and young adults.
Yeah.
And so what we do in these blog posts is we try to make the information accessible to all. So try to get rid of some of the jargon if you're not an expert in the field, make it understandable. We also realize that some people in the DLD community have difficulty reading. And so we have made sure that all the blog posts you can just click and you can listen instead of having to read them. If you prefer listening over reading, there's that option. And lots of people prefer that, even if you're a good reader, just because you're busy and you want to listen in the car or something like that, right? So that's possible. And then the other thing we always do is list sources at the end. And maybe no one ever goes to those sources, that's fine. But at least we are showing that this is not coming out of our opinions, right? This is
Mm.
coming out of an evidence base that scientists have generated. So we're really proud of the product. And of course, it's a work in progress, as those things are. You're always adding to them. And you ask if I have hope about something that we can do to make the current situation better. And I think one of the small steps that I've been thinking about lately is I've thought about people who have DLD, their families, their teachers, their speech language pathologists. I've never really thought about trying to get that information in the hands of policymakers. And I
Mm.
think it would be critical right now to make sure that the people who are deciding on policies and laws that
Mm.
affect access to education, access to special education, access to healthcare are getting legitimate evidence-based info. So well, you'll have to ask me back for my next chapter, but that's something that I look forward to trying in the very, very near future.
That's that is amazing. And at the end of it all, it is the people above us in leadership positions in politics that are ultimately making the decisions
Right.
that affect
Right.
everyday people.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
and something that I'd love to bring to the table now is, say I'm a person, I'm just a consumer of information, but I have my own story to tell, my own experiences. And the way I receive information really does depend on my feelings at the time, my experiences at the time. Um, and even if it's misinformation, right? Let's say that's on the table too. If somebody has repeated it enough,
Mm,
I don't know, there's actually a stat about how many times you repeat something, whether it's right or wrong, that it starts to take shape and starts to have its own life.
right.
What would you say to people that are, again, everyday people that are reading about different bits and pieces that are consuming this information and for whatever reason are starting be, to question, well, which one is right and why is it right? And if we're saying myths need to be debunked, but then that's a question, but also the other end within science or where there is credible information, that's a question too. So which one? I suppose the parallel threads. I don't know if I've, yeah, even making sense with the question.
No, 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 of course you are. Yeah, so I think you're asking about how as consumers, and we're all consumers of information, right? And how do we know? How do we consume well, right? How do
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
know that we're not believing it just because we've heard it a lot?
Mm,
How do we become critical thinkers? How do
mm,
we find good sources? It's of course, it's a giant question.
mm,
I think part of having a good education is learning to think critically and to evaluate what you hear in terms of its logic and soundness.
mm,
And again, I think that there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the drift towards authoritarianism in the United States,
mm,
um, the success of that depends greatly on decreasing the quality of
mm,
education. I think it's not only pushing out misinformation, it's making sure that people are not going to be critical thinkers and good consumers of information. So it's a two-pronged approach.
mm,
It's a very scary thing. One thing that is happening to our education system that very directly impacts children with communication and learning challenges, the kids that we all spend so much time hoping to support, working to support, is this was only, let me look at my notes so I can say it correctly. This only happened, I think, a few weeks ago. Oh, yeah, there it is. Um, a few weeks ago, Friday, October 10th, our government fired almost everyone in the Office of Special Education in our National Department of Education. And so, what the Office of Special Education does at the national level is they work as sort of a safety net to make sure that what in the United States is called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So
mm,
it's the law that makes sure that children with disabilities of various sorts can access a good
yeah.
education, right? And so they really serve sort of two functions. One is my understanding is that they take lots of calls from families who are trying to understand the system and how do you access special education for children who need that support. And the other thing they do is you're kind of a watchdog at the federal level on the different states to make sure that they're upholding the law fairly and accurately. And those people are all gone now. So it's, those kinds of policy decisions will have huge impacts on receiving a good quality education in the US, and especially for our most vulnerable learners, those that need supports in order to do that. It's a tragedy.
That's, you know, Carla, again, what you're saying gets me to think about strategies that are conceived and actually acted upon where it comes to curating and fostering the types of questions people can ask or are not made
Mhm.
to ask and are carefully. So, Carla, I was just thinking about, and I'll have to be very careful about how I word this. There are, because this is to do with strategy and what, when information or misinformation is pushed out, what it actually does, the impact of that on people and the impact of that on people's thinking, their questions, their subsequent actions, and then everything else after that. And that takes a life of its own. But
Right.
also, when we think about strategic thinking, is that the goal? Is that the goal for when such things happen to perhaps get people either to reduce asking questions or ask almost basic questions or questions that have previously been answered and we're getting away from it.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's what it got me thinking about is
Right.
also history.
Right.
Where has the power shift been? Where has just even, I think about my own journey as a human and as a human who was so naive in the Western world and thought everything was just it's a well-oiled machine, but you get
Mhm.
into the machine and you really start to see where the rust is and where the flaws are and where it's not well oiled.
That's
And
right.
that, yeah, and then you ask different questions. But when you
That's
don't know, you don't know where to try to find these spots either.
Yeah. Yeah, I have two thoughts in response to that observation. And one is at the broader level, at the level of democracy, I, as someone who grew up in a democracy, I've always lived in the United States.
Mm,
I took it for granted that our system of checks and balances made it so that our democracy is very strong.
mm,
I didn't realize until now that it's actually very fragile. It's a very fragile thing, a democracy, and that our success that we've had, to the extent that we've had it,
mm,
has been largely dependent on having leaders who I, whether I agree or disagree with their policies, they were at least um, they had some common sense, they had some morality,
mm,
um, but yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's amazing how fragile it is, and I never thought that it was.
mm,
Um, so I think that speaks a little bit to your question, and then the more precise observation you were making, I think, is maybe um, inhibiting the asking of
mm,
questions
mm,
and therefore the consuming of information. And I mean, that's what scientists do, right? They ask
mm,
questions for a living. That's
mm,
what scientists do.
mm,
And there have been I think when a scientist is naive, scientists too consume misinformation. I'm sure I have. Then they may not be asking the most important
Mhm.
questions,
Mhm.
right? Their own biases or uh, their own set of misinformed beliefs
Mm.
can guide them to the wrong questions, or at least less important questions than one would, hope that you would spend all that time and money and passion pursuing. More directly, there are actually questions now that scientists are not supposed to ask in the United States.
Mm.
So we're not supposed to ask questions that have to do with gender.
Mm.
Um, and we're not supposed to ask questions that have to do with race, in terms of equity, inclusion, kinds of issues. And that it kind of goes back to where we started, that people are taking opinions as facts.
Mm.
And so some people have the opinion that there's no such thing as gender, that you have there's sex, you can be a male or a female, that's it,
Mm.
which is also not a fact, but that's their opinion.
Mm.
But then they reject the sort of more psychosocial aspects of gender,
Mm.
and the diversity of gender.
Mm.
And because they say gender's not real, then
Mm.
therefore you can't ask scientific questions about gender because gender's not real, right? So it's a very dangerous, slippery slope. You know, there, yeah, it's a very dangerous slope. Obviously, well, let's put it back to the field that we share. Let's think about that. If you can't ask questions about gender, then we may well limit our understanding of how language disorders present in girls versus boys, men versus women. Maybe it's not the same, but we can't know that if we can't look at it. We could miss issues on, well, I don't do voice interventions. I don't know anything about voice interventions. You wouldn't want me to do it. But people say who are transitioning to a new gender and want to see a therapist.
Mhm.
Well, you're not supposed to do research on how to do that well because gender doesn't exist, right? So there are all kinds of implications, even for our field. Um, there are also implications for training the next generation of clinicians and scientists, because all of the programs in the United States devoted to diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI is what we call it. It probably has different names in different places, but initiatives and schemes meant to make sure that students, people of color, women, any underrepresented minority has a solid chance at participating, to being in grad school, getting training to be a professional, a scientist, a clinician, whatever. And those monies have dried up as well, because it's sort of the explanation for it going away is this reverse, that it's like, well, we can't treat one group more specially than another, therefore DEI initiatives are illegal, because you would be treating a person of color better than you would be treating a white person. I mean, it's completely flipped over. It doesn't make any sense. It's not true, but that's my point, is that there's so many opinions and biases presented as truth to justify what's happening. And those things have huge consequences. I mean, at least the United States, speech language pathology is way too white. And I say that as a very white person, but we've known that for ages, that I think we would be a better profession and we would serve the communities we serve better if we were a more diverse profession. But this kind of policy decision makes it even less likely that we're going to reach that goal of becoming a more diverse group.
Carla, something that I think about when it comes to research, it's the demographics. That's how we research is what what fits where. Even these questions, how do you not ask specific questions without targeting or having those groups within those questions? Isn't that how research is actually conducted? Is thinking about demographics, thinking about, well, what differentiates one from the other. And I don't know, am I being such a naive consumer of research?
Well, especially in our field where I think our field is um, both very wonderful and at the same time very vulnerable to what's
Yeah.
happening in the United States because it's sort of an intersection of um, education, healthcare, and
Mm,
disability. And people with disabilities are another underrepresented group. And
yeah.
so if we start to let go of ways to support that community, then they're going to be less likely to be included in our research labs and our research studies, in our universities, in our, in our communities, right? Our professional communities. So yes, yes, I think your science, your question was going to, isn't science better if it's inclusive? And yes, I think so.
And the other thing that I think about is the money, I suppose not the money, and this might be a somewhat naive statement, is perhaps where the money is for research. A lot of it actually is within the Western world,
Mm.
um,
Mm.
as
Yeah.
opposed to other parts of the world, just because of different complexities. And if we're going to be losing out on research due to things we've been discussing on in this conversation, then that also has another impact in that that's not going to be conducted somewhere else where potentially it could, right? But if the money isn't there to begin with, for
Right. I
yeah,
mean, I think they're right. I think there might be, yeah, I think the damage done to science in the United States will be long lasting. And I don't think it will be, even if it stopped tomorrow, the damage, I think
mm,
there's already been critical damage done. Um, there's already signs of a brain drain, people who are scientists wanting to learn, moving to other countries, um, so that they can be safe and so that they can ask the questions they want to ask. Um, so yeah, I don't really think that we can just hope that another country will pick up the slack.
mm,
Perhaps some countries will benefit from our brain drain, and that would be great, I suppose, in terms
mm.
of keeping science going. Um, but yeah, I think the damage in the U.S. has already been done, and I think what we would hope for now is to stem the damage as quickly as we can.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And Carla, for the work you do at present, tell us a bit more about it and what you are looking forward to, particularly within your role and your scope.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think I already mentioned that I'd love to turn some of my attention to informing policy with scientific evidence. Another thing that our colleagues and I have been doing more of, my more senior colleagues and I have been doing more than ever, is trying to support early career scientists in the United States. As hard as it is to be a
Mm,
scientist in the United States, it's got to be especially hard to be an early career scientist in the United States
mm,
because that's it's never an easy moment in the career
mm,
anyway. And just the anxiety and fear around cuts in educational programs and cuts in research funding it's got to be very frightening. And so we are trying on an individual or small group level to support our early career scientists in the many ways that we can think of to do it. We have more writing groups, we have more, and sometimes we stop writing and talk, just to have some
Mm.
supports. We've been sharing extant data sets that probably were getting dusty anyway, and someone should be mining them. So I think there's small steps that people are doing. I think people are not giving up
Mm.
at all.
Mm.
And I think that's where the hope, I think you said, what are you looking forward to? What are you hoping for? I think that's where the hope comes in, is that people are going about their everyday work, and if anything, doubling down on their commitment to that.
Mm.
I actually want to, I said I wasn't going to mention any names, but I've asked this person in advance if I may use their name. And so I actually wanted to share with your listeners. This was amazing to me. So let me give a little bit of background. So in our field in the US, we have the American Speech Language Hearing Association, and they publish a magazine.
Mm.
And so it's like a professional magazine. And because they're turning 100 years old, a recent issue of the magazine invited people throughout the field to write about what they thought the profession would be like in 100 years from now.
Wow.
And so I was really taken with this one essay, and it's written by a clinical colleague. Her name is Fong Lian Palafox. And I asked Fong if I could share, and she was happy that for me to share her name. If you want to read the whole thing, you can certainly find it. But what I liked about her essay was that she was, writing from a perspective of what it might be, imagine what it might be in 100 years. And she had a very ideal, utopian kind of vision about what it's going to be in 100 years. And I just want to read just this one little piece. So she's looking back. So she's 100 years from now. She's looking back to now. And she wrote, the 2020s and early 2030s saw major regressions. Vocabulary was stripped from public policy. So that's our banning gender, banning, multilingual learners and divergent students bore the weight of institutional erasure. The systems weren't just overwhelmed, they were unjust. And yet, school-based SLTs, speech language therapists, continue to show up, not just with data, but with heart, not just to serve, but to shift systems. And I love that. I love that optimistic view. And then, so the essay's over, and there's an author's note from Fong Lian, and she says, I wrote this piece not out of naivete, but with the full awareness of the present. I see the quiet advocacy, the deliberate acts of agency, and above all, a persistent, powerful hope from my colleagues. And I thought, wow, that's how you resist authoritarianism. You keep showing up, and if you want the world to be better, you show up and you make the world better, right? I just loved her vision. It really meant a lot to read that at this point in time for me.
Those words are so powerful, and it almost, you can visualize it. You can visualize that concept, and it seems so concrete because this is what's happening in the world. But to be able to still hold firm in our beliefs, and at the end of the day, make voices heard, including your own,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
isn't that like sometimes I do think about being a purpose of a human being? We think about our callings, this, that, the other, but is finding our own voice one of those callings? And that changes as life changes. You could be in a different era and it's just a different sound, pitch, whatever metaphor you use. But is it authentic? Where is it coming from? And if we want to do that for ourselves, we know we're never individualistic. There is a whole myriad of people that come to shine light on those voices. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think our voices change as we mature.
Mm.
We find courage to use our voice. And I think circumstances like the circumstances that we in the United States are in right now make it much more important than ever before to use your voice.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that power of being able to convey a message with the breadth, depth, and actual intent
Mhm.
um, is is quite a gift.
Right.
But like you said, democracy is fragile. The different parts actually, then is it a lot of it is fragile, but beliefs, systems, morals, ethics, the things that we teach children,
Mhm.
the irony is they tend to get lost for us as adults, as we're growing up, we are trying so hard to steer it in the right direction that we know. Again, it's subjective.
Yeah.
Um, but how much work goes into showing up and making sure, okay, this is where we want to go. Of course, mistakes are made along the way, but at the end of the day, that foundational piece, what is that foundation? Solid ground. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And I think we who are in the field of speech language pathology, whether as a scientist or a clinician, we have such an amazing opportunity
Mm.
to um, to make a difference, to make the world better just by doing our work,
Yeah.
and then to kind of link back to also help future humans, future grown-up humans,
Mm.
to really find and use their voice, right? In a quite literal way. So I think it's an amazing calling and opportunity that we have.
That's right. And I think about it like doing it within the field, but also out of it, just different interactions that we're having in life or seeing things. Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting to think about, Carla. But as we do wrap up our conversation, has there been anything that I haven't asked you or something that you have wanted to share and we haven't gone there?
Hmm. Well, I think we have covered most of the things that you're a very gifted and intuitive interviewer. So I think we've journeyed together into most of the topics that I was hoping we would cover. I think when you wrote me, you said that you wanted to think about what a utopia would look
Yeah,
like, what my utopia would look
yeah.
like. Should I talk about that?
That would be wonderful. Yeah.
It's yeah, okay. So again, just I think utopia would be a society where there's equity and there's
Mm.
people are treated humanely, people are treated justly.
Mm.
Um, and of course, that kind of utopian vision is very much on my mind because of my current context. But I also think that to be more everyday about it and a little bit less grandiose about it, I
Mm.
think utopia would have a lot of books and a lot of dogs and a lot of good food and wine.
Yeah.
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 Those are, parts of my life that made me really happy.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, yeah, books and dogs.
Yes. Oh, I visualize a cornucopia of sorts with, yes, the food, but yeah, indulging in. good conversations, indulging, because that can be contagious and that can be anything that we say or think about gets other people thinking about it as well. Good,
Right.
bad, or ugly, doesn't matter.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Well, that's gotta be part of your utopia, right? That's why you
yeah,
do this, because you really value a great conversation.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. It really is like a book that I have the privilege and luxury of stepping into every time. Yeah, I have the opportunity.
It's a wonderful project. You should congratulate yourself on it. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much, Carla. And for everyone, as we are wrapping up, this conversation is going to be available on Human Chapters YouTube channel, Human Chapters podcast, and will also be available on the Facebook page. Please share it with others. We never know who it might resonate with or where the story it takes once somebody has heard it. So thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're welcome.